Hi, this is Steve Worona, and you're listening to Campus Public Safety Online from the National Center for Campus Public Safety. Before I introduce today's speaker, here's a brief orientation to the Adobe Connect interface we're using. Your browser right now is showing the title slide for today's talk. On the left side of your screen, you'll see a box labeled Questions and Comments where you can read and type messages. There's a tab labeled Everyone at the bottom of this box, and that's the tab you'll use for all of your general messages, including questions and comments for our speaker. We'll be breaking for questions several times during the presentation, so please do not hold your questions to the end. You can also send direct messages to a specific person by hovering your cursor over a name in the attendee list. One of those names is Technical Help, and that's the place to go if you run into technical problems. We're also monitoring Twitter for your questions and comments. Use hashtag NCCPSWebinar. That's NCCPSWebinar. If you missed part of today's conversation, or if you want to see some or all of it again, this webinar is being recorded and captioned. The link will be available shortly after the webinar on the NCCPS Webinars page, and watch your email for a link to a brief evaluation survey requesting your reactions and comments on today's session. Please take a minute to respond to that survey when the link arrives. We do appreciate your feedback. And now for today's presentation. Most campuses develop safety and emergency protocols to meet the needs of college students and adult visitors. But take a look around your institution, and you'll notice a lot of kids. How do minors fit into your safety and emergency plans? For example, are you cataloging your youth-serving programs? Are you prepared to deal with a lost child at graduation or a missing kid at camp? Have you considered whether a campus public safety officer should interview a 5-year-old about suspected child abuse or neglect? Well, today's webinar will raise these and other vital questions and offer practical options for resolving them. Our speaker is Franke, a recognized expert in the protection of children on college and university campuses. Ann's expertise covers risk management, employment, student affairs, and governance, with a subspecialty in the protection of children. She has worked with institutions nationwide to safeguard the minors with whom they interact, and since 2013 has served as volunteer coordinator of the Youth Protection Network for Higher Education, a group she founded. She writes for publications including the Chronicle of Higher Education, Inside Higher Ed, Trusteeship, and Academe, and previously held senior positions with the United Educators Insurance and AAUP, the American Association of University Professors. She's a fellow of NACUA, the National Association of College and University Attorneys, and received a national award from the Stetson University College of Law for her innovative approach to campus risk management. Anne received her BA, MA, and JD degrees from the University of Pennsylvania and an LLM from Georgetown. Anne Franke, welcome to Campus Public Safety Online.
Well, thank you, Steve. It's my great pleasure. I'll tell you, I've been a fan of the National Center since it was merely a gleam in the eye of my friends Gary Margolis and Steve Healy. So it's a pleasure to be contributing to the Center's great work through today's webinar. Since 2011, when the Sandusky tragedy at Penn State came to light, higher education has devoted increased attention to the protection of minors. These efforts at institutions draw from many campus units. Those may include public safety, risk management, compliance, youth programming, conference services, emergency management, the general counsel's office. And I was pleased to see that our audience today reflects this same diversity. We have people from many different parts of the institution, and the protection of minors is an exercise in making linkages across different parts of campus. So whatever your campus role is, I'm hoping that you'll find something of value in today's program. Now, the subtitle for the webinar today is really, who are all these kids running around on campus? Who's responsible for them? And then hyperbolically, not me, I hope. I'd like to take a moment on some vocabulary. I'll be using the terms children, youth, minors, and kids pretty much interchangeably today. When institutions draft campus policies, they tend to define those terms in specific ways. But in our freewheeling webinar, you may hear me talking about youth or children or kids or minors, legal minors. So just know that those are interchangeable for today's purposes. Now, moving on to the substance of our program, I've divided the content into these 4 major subject areas, and you see them on the slide: the institutional approaches to child safety, challenges in emergency planning and response, abuse and neglect reporting, and children who may become separated from a parent at a public event or from a program, or separated because of an emergency that has occurred on campus. So let's get started with institutional approaches to child safety. You may find, once you really start looking around at your institution's interaction with children, that you serve more youth in a given year than you have enrolled students. This is a surprise to some people when they first start creating an inventory of their youth-serving programs. It's less of a surprise at land-grant institutions that have 4-H programs. Those 4-H programs can bring in $250,000, $500,000. I've heard numbers up to 700,000 minors interacting with the institution in a year. But even if you're a small liberal arts institution, you'll likely find that there are massive numbers of youth with whom your institution interacts. Now, since the Sandusky tragedy, institutions have been paying new attention to these concerns. And I've noticed 3 basic models in how colleges and universities address the overall subject of youth protection. Some institutions have a centralized approach, and under this rubric, there's one individual in the central administration who is responsible for enforcing a policy, educating youth programs about the policy, checking in on them to see whether they are meeting their obligations under the policy, and also serving as a resource person, a central resource person for the youth-serving programs. I should pause just a moment to say that youth-serving programs can be spread throughout an institution, from the robotics camp in the engineering school to the baseball team visiting an elementary school to the HR office doing a volunteer project tutoring in the local soup kitchen. You have student organizations, staff and faculty. You have organized camps and programs. You also have a lot of activities. So a sorority or fraternity might decide to do a fundraiser by offering babysitting services one night. So we have programs and activities that are spread really wall-to-wall within the institution. So the centralized approach is one model that has become really quite common. Some institutions prefer to decentralize the control. And here, I was just looking at Notre Dame the other day, and each of several subunits within the university is responsible for creating its own inventory of child-serving programs, making sure that background checks are conducted, providing training. And so it seemed to me like a half a dozen or perhaps a dozen people or units across the university really shared that central administrative responsibility. So there were policies and procedures rather than one central voice speaking to their enforcement and interpretation. It was a more decentralized model. And the third model I might suggest is called the Wild West approach, which may be, well, we haven't really gotten to work yet on this, or the sports camps are doing a good job, but we're not so sure about the student organizations. So the Wild West approach is one in which the institution may not yet have taken a systematic look and developed an approach to its youth-serving programs. Now let me ask, what youth-serving programs are occurring on your campus today? Who at your institution is able to answer that question? A corollary is what youth programs are occurring off campus. Over the years, I've seen many times that the college student study abroad trip or the work at the observatory or at the archaeological site are places where policies tend to be forgotten and grievance procedures may not reach. Similarly, with youth programming, there can be off-campus programs. I've seen examples of schools that take high school students to Europe for 3 weeks in the summer, that kind of thing. So while I speak about on-campus programming, we also need to keep off-campus programming in mind as well. And here's some more questions I want you to ask yourself and ask your colleagues. Who's got contact information for a parent or guardian for each child in those programs that are occurring today? Who should have that contact information? And let me here pause a moment to remind you of the very tragic mass shooting that occurred in Norway in 2011, where a lone wolf gunman went to a Norwegian summer camp and killed 69 people, most of them youth, and caused 110 injuries. So while in the U.S. we have not seen episodes of mass shooting directed at campers, and certainly not on that scale, it's a possibility. And so that reinforces the need for someone to be able to have contact information for the parents or guardians of the children. Another relevant question is, what do we expect of outside groups that rent our facilities for youth programs? So an institution may run its own programs, or it may simply make its facilities available to outside groups. In the resource materials, and I'll be referring to them from time to time during the program, on pages 7 through 9, you'll find a list of possible contract provisions to consider including in your contracts with outside groups that rent your facilities for youth programming. Their own child protection policies, sexual assault and molestation insurance, operational protocols are among the things that your institution should consider imposing on those outside groups that do rent your campus facilities. And youth programming and youth interactions with higher education institutions raise a whole host of compliance issues. Different parts of the institution may have responsibility for different elements of this compliance. On the left-hand side, under the federal laws, we have the Clery Act. So regardless of the status of a victim of crime, if that crime occurs on Clery-covered property, you need to be including it in your Clery report. So a camper at an outside group renting your facility is a victim of a covered crime. Are you going to have that information reported into you so that you can include it in your Clery statistics? We have FERPA issues for minors who are enrolled. And then with respect to the institution's own camps, and even those outside camps, we have issues of disability accommodation, harassment and assault, and even age discrimination. There's a federal age discrimination law that does not have a lower age limit. So you need to think through that set of issues when you're looking at youth programming. And then for youth who are employed, there can be issues under OSHA. Now, please imagine a big asterisk here next to the state law list, because let's see if I can get the because the state law issues really do take on great importance. And here you have some of the issues, and background checks would probably be a good thing to put on this list because there are often but not always state laws that do address background checks for camps and camp staff. And in the subsequent sections of our webinar, we'll be looking in greater detail at the last two items, emergency planning and abuse and neglect reporting. So I've covered a lot of landscape, and let me mention that in the resource materials, again, there's an article that I wrote just last month on compliance and youth serving programs. So on the resource materials on page 10, you'll find a much fuller analysis of this. Steve, I wonder if this is a good moment to ask our audience if they have any questions so far.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Anne. We are with Anne Franke, and today's topic is planning for the safety of minors, routine and emergency situations. We have several pauses planned for Anne to address your questions and comments. Don't wait till the end. Type them into the chat box there on the left side of your screen. And Carolyn Shelton wonders, can you speak briefly to the benefits and considerations for having a centralized registry for youth programs?
That would be my default preference, I would say, because of the many parts of the institution that need to interact. And we'll be looking in a few moments on, for example, how public safety may interact with youth serving programs. That would be much more complicated if those public safety people had to coordinate with half a dozen or a dozen people around the institution. So say they find a missing or a kid who's wandering around, and the kid says, oh, I'm with the STEM field camp program. And it might be more challenging for the public safety officer to figure out what that really is or where in the university that program is housed. But going to a centralized source would make that much easier. There are some institutions that really are quite decentralized. So if you have a lot of branch campuses, or if your organizational structure almost puts more power in the deans than in the provost, those kinds of structures might lend themselves to a decentralized approach. But as I say, my default would be a centralized coordination.
Thanks, Anne. A number of folks are wondering about getting these resources. So there's two ways. On your screen in the lower left corner, you'll see a box labeled Click to Download Files. And the first reference in there is Anne's slides, which you can download. And the second says Resources, and that is a PDF of the resources Anne is describing. Both of those, the slides and the resources, will also be available on the NCCPS webpage, along with a recording of this webinar. And all of that will be available in a couple of days. Let me squeeze in one more question during this break. Anne, what is FERPA for minors?
All right. Well, the quick answer on that is there are differences in FERPA for K through 12 schools and for colleges. If a student is enrolled in a K through 12 setting, the parents have the right to inspect the records, among other things. In a college setting, the student controls who can inspect the records. So if a high school student is dual enrolled in high school and college, you end up with a situation that for the high school records, the parents have automatic access. For the college records, the parents may have access if the student is a tax dependent or the student has given consent for the parents to see those education records. So it's Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act addresses who can inspect a student's education records, how privately are those maintained within the institution.
Okay, thanks, Anne. We are not going to lose those questions that have come in yet. We'll hold them for the next break, but in the meantime, we'll let you get back to your presentation with slide 9.
All right, terrific. And I'd like now to move into the area of emergency planning and response. And let me read you this somewhat hair-raising quote, but it may apply to your institution as well. Within hours of Hurricane Ike's landfall in Texas, San Antonio officials had compiled precise statistics about their evacuee situation. They knew the city would need to care for 5,303 people, 561 of whom had special needs, and 642 pets. But there was one key group for which they had no figures: children. So if there were an emergency at your institution, are you prepared to deal with those many children who may be under your care and control at any given moment? The numbers of children probably vary at your institution between July, when there are many, many more, and October, when there are many fewer. But I hazard a guess that every day of the week, throughout the year, there will be children interacting in some formal way with your institution. Now, in the emergency planning world, we have a lot of resources for higher education institutions, and we have a lot of resources for K through 12 schools, and then to a lesser degree, there are resources for camps. I've decided that what we really need to do is to create a hybrid emergency plan that incorporates relevant elements of the camps and the K through 12 schools. You may even have infants or pre-K, nursery school age toddlers at your institution. So K through 12, sort of read that with a grain of salt, of children through high school. When I was a kid, I loved the peanuts that gave you an extra nut on the inside of the shell. And so I've used that picture because we need higher education camps and school emergency planning principles all to come together in an emergency for an educational institution. Now, think about kids' needs in emergencies. They need supervision. They need more supervision than college students need. They need emotional support. We sometimes think of undergraduates, particularly in those first 2 years of college, as being relatively fragile and needing a lot of emotional support. Well, I'll tell you, an emergency strikes a child much more dramatically than it does someone who is older, than an older teen. And so in the emotional support realm, there are greater needs for the children. Children need communication, and their needs here, again, are different from those of college students. Nourishment, shelter. You have cribs and playpens that would be adequate to the youngest children who may be at your institution, and even diapers. So as you stock in supplies for your emergencies, please keep these issues in mind. And Steve, I just want to take a half a minute to tell a cute story. In my neighborhood, there's a child care center that's near a rather upscale hotel. One afternoon, the child care center was required to evacuate due to some building emergency. So they went to the hotel, the staff and the children. I think this was an unplanned arrival at the hotel, but the hotel staff took it in stride. They brought out lots of comforters for the kids to play on in an empty meeting room, and they brought peanut butter and jelly sandwiches in silver serving platters for these kids. So I'm not expecting your institution to do that, but I do want you to have plans for the children who may be interacting with your institution. Now, we mentioned state law and emergency planning, and here are just a couple of samples of state laws that address emergency planning for camps. The one on the left speaks to having a communication system, including a triangle, a bell, or a voice. Now, as colleges and universities have invested heavily in emergency communications, it's quite quaint to see the reference to a triangle or a bell as part of your communication system, but it would suffice for certain camps. And then there are states in which camps are required to have emergency procedures. Now, I'm sort of dangling before you the possibility that there are some regulations. What are the regulations in your state? Fortunately, we can thank the American Camp Association for providing a great finding tool. Their website is acacamps.org. And in their resource library, they have a collection state by state of laws and regulations on camps. Go there, look up your state, and look up the requirements. You also need to know your institution's policies as you're putting together emergency plans, but this ACA resource is just a really terrific one, and I'm grateful to the ACA that this is not behind a members-only firewall. It's a real public service that they're doing. Now, we've covered the sort of the extraordinary disaster situation. And I hope that abuse and neglect reporting is an unusual situation for your institutions. The Sandusky case has reinforced the importance of this for every college and university. Are you a mandatory reporter of child abuse and neglect in your state or at your institution? Now, I divided this slide into the left side and the right side. The left side represents the 19 states, plus or minus, where every adult is a mandatory reporter of child abuse. In the majority of states, designated professions are mandatory reporters. Those may include coaches, teachers, healthcare professionals. In some states, they include IT staff and camp directors. So you need to understand your state law on child abuse and neglect reporting. And in a moment, I'm going to give you another terrific finding tool to learn what those are. Now, this, under most state laws, regardless of whether it's the everybody needs to report or only designated people need to report, one needs to report reasonable suspicions or knowledge about child abuse or child neglect. The difference between abuse and neglect is that neglect is the withholding of necessities of life, food, shelter, education, health care. Those constitute child neglect. But child abuse is the infliction of physical pain, sexual experiences, pornography viewing, those kinds of things on children. And the suspicions that must be reported involve people who are under the state's age of majority. Now, let me give you a little a legal insight here. University child protection policies typically apply to minors who are not enrolled at the institution. So if I'm a 17-year-old first-year student or even a 16 or 15-year-old first-year student enrolled in the college, the youth protection policy would not apply to me. So my teachers may not need to have background checks, and they may not need to be trained, and there are just a variety of elements of that policy that typically do not apply to enrolled students. However, if I'm that 15-year-old college student, even though the college's youth protection policy may not apply to me, the state law on the mandatory reporting of child abuse or neglect does apply to me. There's no carve-out for enrolled college students in the mandatory reporting of child abuse and neglect, even though we're making a carve-out in the higher education setting. Now, at the bottom of this slide, you see a useful note to keep in mind. On a statistical basis, most child abuse, unfortunately, occurs in the home or in the community. So it's the grandparent or the scout leader who becomes a abuser or might neglect a child. And that is more likely than abuse occurring in your campus program. So what does this amount to? What it means is that a child in your college sport camp is more likely to reveal possible abuse in the home than abuse in the institution, simply because that home abuse is more likely on a statistical basis to be occurring. So here's a good example. I worked with a national museum at one point, and they experienced an episode where a child came up to a museum guard who was in a uniform and had a badge on and looked like a police officer, and asked a sort of a loaded question along the lines of, is it okay for a mother to beat her son? And so this was potentially an outcry from the child seeking help from an authority figure of abuse in the home. So your staff and faculty and student volunteers and everybody else needs to be alert to the possibility that a child comfortable in the setting of a college camp or a college tutoring program might begin to make a disclosure of potential abuse in the home. Statistically, that's more likely, and we need to be prepared for it. So I promised you another good state law finding tool, and here we have the federal government to thank. There's a website called the Child Welfare Information Gateway that in its state resources section has state-by-state information on who's a mandated reporter of abuse, where you have to make the report, what the definition of child abuse and child neglect are. And you see at the bottom that the website is childwelfare.gov. And again, I use this often, and if you're not familiar with your own state law on abuse and neglect reporting, this is a great place to get started. And Steve, I think this is a great place, again, for questions that might be coming in from the audience.
Absolutely, and they are coming in, and keep them coming. Adrienne wonders, I notice in the resources you mentioned Title IX as a federal law to comply with. My question is, if an outside organization is using our facilities for their program, do we still need to report to Title IX?
That is a very tricky legal question, and I'd say talk to your institution's lawyer. Here's the crux of the issue. Title IX is designed to provide people access to the benefits of education. An outside camp may not be providing those benefits of education on behalf of your institution. So there is a reasonable legal argument that Title IX would not apply to that outside camp. Nonetheless, if there were a sexual assault, and frankly, camper-to-camper assault is more likely than staff-to-camper assault, that may be a Clery crime that you need to report on your Clery statistics. I don't think I would turn my back on a camper who's maybe suffering this kind of assault. I'd work with the outside group. I'd try to make it right. I doubt that you would need to crank up your entire Title IX machinery, but in terms of assisting the child, assisting that outside group in addressing the situation, I think you might be well positioned to do that. So it's a tricky legal question, and I'd say discuss it with your campus counsel. And also it's something to consider including in your contract with the outside groups. Whose grievance procedures, who's responsible for addressing disability discrimination. If a child has a peanut allergy, back to my picture of peanuts, is the outside group responsible for making sure that kid doesn't make a peanut butter sandwich in your cafeteria? So how to parse out the responsibilities for those civil rights issues can get very tricky, as this good question suggests. Long answer, easy question, hard question to answer.
There's a lot like that. This might be in the same category. Marcy Gardner would like some best practices for emergency management protocols involving minors on campus.
All right. Marcy, in the resource materials, let me see where I have covered those. There are some emergency management resources, and I was talking to Steve just before the program that I wanted to add in one more. Let me just find the right page. There, yes, if you look at pages 4 and 5, at the bottom of page 4, you'll see one sample emergency action plan. You'll see a security checklist, and then reunification after disaster is something that we'll talk about in a moment, but that's another area where I'll be giving you an extra resource. So there are some things that might be helpful to Marcy.
Let me squeeze in one more during this break. You were talking about the how the regulations relate to minors who might actually be enrolled college students. What about early college high school programs on college campuses?
With respect to early college programs, what element are we looking at again? I'm sorry.
What are the college's responsibilities for minors that are enrolled in early college? They may not be enrolled as students in the college, but they're in some early college high school program on the college campus.
Mm-hmm, yeah. Well, we could do a webinar on that topic too. I think it's the most important piece there is for the parents to understand what it means for the child to be in a college environment. So there are no filters on the internet, and there may be adult content in classes, and your child may be in a study group with people twice his or her age. There may be non-traditionally aged college students. Your child may be in a study group with a registered sex offender. So the full disclosure to the parents, preferably with the parents signing off that they have received all those disclosures, are one way to help families understand the dynamics of a college environment and the dynamics of an early college program. I think those early college enrollees don't need cribs and playpens, but they may need certain extra kinds of support, and the people running the program would be good collaborators in designing disclosures for parents and also any special requirements for the programs. If the early college people are separated into their own classrooms, it could be a very good idea to do training and background checks, especially for the faculty who may be interacting with those early college students.
Okay. We will hang on to the questions. We won't lose them, folks. Keep them coming in. We've got a final break at the end, but in the meantime, Anne, we'll let you get back to your presentation.
All right. Well, what I'd like to do now is really get operational, which some of the questions have been drawing us to already. And I'd like to look first at the issue of reporting suspicions or knowledge of child abuse. Here, most policies involve reporting within the institution and also reporting to state government. Even if your state is one in which only certain categories of people must report to state government, by policy, some schools are saying everybody needs to report to state government and everybody needs to report within the institution if they have reasonable suspicions or knowledge about child abuse or child neglect. Now, as you draft your policy, one tricky question is which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Do you want people to first report within the institution or first report to state government? Much to their credit, Penn State is now a leader in the protection of children. And as I recall the Penn State policy, anybody who becomes aware in their professional capacity of a suspicion of child abuse, they first should call the state government or contact the state government, and second, contact the institution. Other institutions prefer to flip that order and have the reporting first within the institution and then to state government. So there's some policy pros and cons to either approach, but I just want people to be aware that this is an operational question. It's not going to come up terribly often, but when it does come up, you don't want to be putting impediments in the way of people reporting these suspicions to the state. That's my default position here would be report first to the state and then within the institution. But if you need help in making the report, you can ask for help within the institution. Some of us, children of the 60s, let's say, harbor suspicions about the government and making reports. I would encourage everybody to lay those aside. The child protection agencies across the country are staffed by very experienced social workers who deal with these issues all the time. So it's not so much ratting someone out as seeking help that may promote the best interest of a child. And that best interest of the child does need to remain paramount. So this operational issue combines both state law and policy. And one other footnote here. In some states, you can report, if you're a mandated reporter, you can either report to state government, the child welfare agency, or you can report to law enforcement. So if your campus police force are sworn officers, a report made to a sworn officer may satisfy a mandatory reporting obligation. So I mentioned that twist. When you go to the Child Welfare Information Gateway, look at where the state reports are made and see whether your campus public safety count as fulfilling that duty of mandatory reporting. Now, another issue for public safety is deciding in advance who would conduct a forensic interview of a child. This is a special art, interviewing a child about potential harms that the child may have suffered. So the interview needs to be child-centered, developmentally sensitive, unbiased, legally defensible. You're not going to want to have somebody asking leading questions. Did the bad man touch you under your panties 10 times? That's, children tend to be suggestible, and so interviews of minors, kids, need to be conducted according to certain protocols. And in the resource materials on pages 3 and 4, I've provided some organizations and written materials that help train law enforcement personnel in this art of conducting forensic interviews of children. Here again, though, my default would be to prefer leaving that task to the state social services staff or law enforcement who do this all the time. In a campus setting, we wouldn't be doing it all the time, but it's probably an area where bringing in the experts makes a lot of sense. Now, another issue kind of straddling police and emergency planning is, how do children really fit in your campus safety operating procedures? Here's some potential issues. If you're transporting kids, do you have a booster seat if the child is 6 years old and too short for sitting in an adult car? What if a child, I'm speaking to the last bullet point here, protecting suspected child abuse victims. Here is your nightmare scenario. It's 2:30 at your camp, and at 3 o'clock the parents come and pick up the campers. 7-year-old becomes concerned at about 2:30, as I mentioned, that I ripped my T-shirt today and my father is going to beat the hell out of me because I ruined my shirt. Now, if that creates a reasonable suspicion that this child is going to be beaten at home, and the parent is coming in 30 minutes, what are you going to do? The camp director or the dean or the youth protection coordinator probably lacks legal authority to take that child into protective custody. You can call child social services. If you have sworn police officers, they may have the legal authority to bring someone into protective custody. But absent those situations, you can stall with the father, but ultimately when push comes to shove, you probably have a legal obligation to turn the child over to the father unless someone like a pediatrician, a state social worker, a police officer takes that child into protective custody. And unfortunately, there are situations where a child has made what's called an outcry and then been sent home with a parent and suffered severe injuries as a consequence of that, of making that outcry. But the law is set up so that parents have the primary control over their own children, and it's only in designated circumstances where other people can intervene. Now, my last topic is children who are separated from a parent or a program. I begin with the premise that releasing a child to an unauthorized adult can be quite dangerous. We have non-custodial parents who are looking for ways to gain access to their children. We've read in the papers about child abduction, taking children to other states or foreign countries. So your starting premise should be, we only release children to authorized adults. We need to know ahead of time who's authorized to pick up this child. We need to confirm identities. And we don't want to run this risk of releasing a child to an unauthorized adult. Now, let's think through graduation. That's over at some institutions and coming up this weekend at some others. And on this slide, I consider the scenario of a child is found in the audience of graduation. So the child is the one who comes forward, or some well-meaning adult takes the child under his or her wing and goes to the usher and says, I think this child is separated from mom and dad, and what are your procedures going to be? So you need to train your ushers on what to do in that circumstance. And an overriding principle is that no adult should be alone with that child in private. So you need 2 adults who monitor your lost children station, perhaps in an open-sided tent, so that there is good visibility into how those adults may be interacting with the children. Now, the other scenario is where the report comes from the parent that my child is missing. There's a lot of work that has been done on this topic, and I'll speak generally to a child who may become missing from a camp, the library, the rec center, the alumni weekend, the graduation. there are coordinated methods. The most popular and well-known one is called Code Adam. And in your resource materials, I've given you uh, some of the basics of Code Adam on, they're back there. Team Adam is a group of retired law enforcement officers around the country who are immediately available to assist in the search for a missing child. Time is critical in these situations, so most good protocols for missing children say that here's what we'll do in the first 5 minutes. Here's what we'll do in the 6th through 15th minute, and at 20 minutes we call 911 if we have not yet found the child. These need to be coordinated efforts with one person in charge, and people need to be trained, not only your ushers and your camp directors, but really anybody who may be responsible in the program. Aquatic searches for missing children have their own variations. In a swimming pool, lifeguards are typically trained in a search for a missing child. It involves searching both the pool bottom and the locker rooms and the hot dog stand and the restrooms. In open water, it's much more complicated. I've given you an example of an open water search for a missing child. Prohibiting campers from swimming in open water is a really good idea. If you have that option, I would suggest that you use it. And I now see I made a note that you'll find resource materials on pages 5 and 6 on protocols for searching for a missing child. And here, let me just mention in terms of reunification, and this refers to emergency reunification in particular, I would suggest looking at what your local school district does. So the school district may have a policy if they have a bomb threat, if they have an active shooter, and the school is evacuated. What is the process for matching up the parents and the children when it's time to release those children? I also have noticed that the University of Louisville has a very good policy on this. And I think that Adam Roof may be posting a link to that website. The University of Louisville and Ohio University, not Ohio State, but Ohio University, have very similar policies, thoughtful, well-developed on reunification after emergencies. And then my almost very last topic for the day is unaccompanied minors on campus. They pose special challenges. This is another one where, Steve, we could do a whole webinar on children who are left in the library while a parent may be taking a community college course, where the university's lab school lets out at 3 p.m., but the parents who work for the university work until 4:30 or 5. There may be unaccompanied minors in droves on the campus. So as I mentioned, libraries, not only in community colleges but elsewhere, rec centers, are situations where institutions may have to struggle with the challenges of unaccompanied minors. And on page 4 in the resources, I've given you some sample policies, including some institution-wide policies and some library-specific policies. I know schools where an unaccompanied minor who appears to be under a given age, say 16, is put in the care of campus public safety. Again, don't be alone with that minor if you're the public safety officer. And then if the parent isn't located within a reasonable amount of time, a call is made to Child Protective Services, because that's how, as a society, we deal with children who are not adequately supervised by their parents. So my pitch here is to check out the resource materials, and I think I've made that pitch pretty well through the program. And then one final pitch. In introducing me, Steve, you kindly mentioned the Youth Protection Network for Higher Education. This is an informal group. It's free. We now have 180 plus members. We do monthly conference calls with programming. We have a listserv, share resources, and I'd be happy to sign up anybody who might be interested in joining in the Youth Protection Network. So I had my track shoes on, and we do have some time left for questions, I think, here.
Okay, and with those track shoes, we'll see how quickly we can blast through these. Do you have any tabletop exercises that test emergency response with the camps and clinics element?
I would look at the American Camp Association. They may have some, and I think it would be fairly easy to create one. You could use the Norwegian mass shooting as an example. You could reverse engineer one of the emergency plans for a camp. So take one of the samples that I've already given you and back it out into a scenario that you create. So in my hip pocket, I don't have one. I think it would not be too complicated either to find one or to create one. And I'll put that on my list of things to think about.
Christine Elderkin wonders, is there a requirement to separate registered sex offenders from enrolled minor college students? Any guidance here?
Being a registered sex offender, sometimes there are conditions imposed on the probation of a sex offender that during the 5 years of probation, say they not be around minors or they not get on the internet. Once their probation is over, it's my understanding that there are no further legally required restrictions on their interacting with children. I'm not an expert in this particular area, so it's worth looking again at your state law, but I know of institutions that do keep track of who their registered sex offenders are. Of course, you need to make the relevant information available to anybody who wants to look it up, but they will go to those sex offenders and say, we know your criminal history, and we're just going to be keeping an eye out on you, and the child care center is over there, and if you're starting to get close to it, we're going to keep an even closer eye on you. So to suggest that there is not any kind of official monitoring, but rather just attention to the situation. People who have served their time, done the crime, served the time, have rights too. And registered sex offenders can be have offended against adults or against children. So it's not just child sex offenders. So you might consider including some qualifications in the background checks that you conduct on staff who will be working with children in terms of their criminal histories of sex offenses with minors. But these individuals do pose special challenges for institutions. They may have a right to an education under state law, and at the same time your environment is one in which there are lots of kids. So as I indicated earlier, disclosure to parents can be your ally in it really just explaining the context of a college or university.
So this is the last one we're going to get to. We've only got a few seconds, but let me squeeze it in. It would be easy to just set requirements that external groups bringing minors to campus are required to provide rosters and have a reunification plan, but would the university be better advised to have their own plan for rosters and accountability of minors and a reunification plan?
So do you want them to have their own, or do you want them to follow yours? a judgment call, which will better serve the interests of the kids. And there's also a legal concept of vicarious liability. There's some institutions that don't want to get too deeply involved in running those outside programs, and so they prefer to put the burden on the outside groups rather than, in effect, taking them over. So no, one of those gray kind of balancing things that you have to do. On the one hand, on the other hand. Wouldn't you like to have a one-handed lawyer who doesn't say on the one hand, on the other hand? I think that's my last word of the day, Steve.
Thanks very much, Anne, and thanks to all of our viewers and questioners from around the Internet. Check the NCCPS webinars page for a link to the captioned recording of today's presentation, as well as a link to our speaker slides and a list of resources on today's topic. The brief evaluation survey that I mentioned earlier should already be in your mailbox. It will take you no more than 2 minutes to complete. Please do. We read and act on your comments. In addition to our Campus Public Safety online webinars, the National Center for Campus Public Safety lists a wide range of other events and resources. You'll find details on the web at nccpsafety.org. Again, that's nccpsafety.org, and registration is now open for the first annual NCCPS Trauma-Informed Sexual Assault Investigation and Adjudication Program event, hosted at the George Washington University, July 18th to 22nd, featuring speakers from the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, Department of Education Office of Civil Rights, Clery Act Compliance Division, Office for Victims of Crimes, the Center for Disease Control, the Victims' Rights Law Center, and the Clery Center for Security on Campus. See the NCCPS webpage or subscribe to our mailing list for registration details. Campus Public Safety Online is brought to you by the National Center for Campus Public Safety with support from the University of Vermont Continuing and Distance Education and the U.S. Department of Justice. Special thanks today to Andrea Young and Adam Roof. This is Steve Worona. See you next time on Campus Public Safety Online.